In March, thousands of Argentines took to the streets in rejection of an agreement reached between its government and the IMF on the repayment of a $45 billion loan.
The weapon that the IMF used to impose essentially the extraterritorial economic interests of the United States on the world was to say, we will only extend loans to you if you abide by a set of rules which force you to abandon protectionism, open yourself up to the United States and so on. That has to go. So abandoning debt slavery, which also is a very big additional burden through the loan repayments that these countries have to make on those countries, is a very important part of the reconstruction of an international order. The creation of a completely different system of trading relations, fair trading relations, in which countries have the right to manage their trade, but they negotiate multilateral arrangements which are win-win arrangements, which are not going to improve what happens to current world trading arrangements. The rich countries tell the world countries what is going to benefit them. That's how it works. It has to be the opposite. You have to have a trading system in which the goal is to raise the productivity and develop the poorer people in the partnerships. So one can see what the elements of such a system might be. And I do think that China, especially working with Russia, is in a position to at least offer systems of that nature to the world. Of course, they wouldn't be the only partners, but I'm hoping the partners in such an arrangement will grow. Something happened around about 1980 of a very fundamental character. There was an institutional change within economics itself, and there was a change in the character of the world financial system. There's a writer called Todaro who writes a very common, what used to be a very common textbook on international economics, in which he describes this as the neoclassical counter-revolution in the world financial institutions. So the World Bank and the IMF were essentially taken over by the philosophy which has become known as neoliberalism. Now, then economics itself was reconstructed. Up until then, the history of economic thought has been dominated by an alternation between what I would call basically scientific discovery. I think under Ricardo was the first time, under Marx was the second time, Keynes the third time, some kind of recognition of the facts from whatever political perspective. That alternates with theoretical counter-revolutions. And these theoretical counter-revolutions come about because once you recognize the facts, you recognize that your capitalists are not such wonderful people after all. So it's very, very threatening to the capitalist class. So they put all sorts of resources, money, into making sure that economic doctrine is something that supports what they believe in. So when it comes to Smith, for example, everybody forgets that Smith was the founder of the theory of value, and instead just remembers that he has the theory of the invisible hand, that the market works perfectly. By the way, even that is very unclear that he actually he unambiguously states that. There's a big literature around Smith's theory of moral sentiments and the conflict between the theory of moral sentiments and the economic doctrine. And there's a man called Don Gertschman who's written on the so-called Smith problem. His book I recommend. And he says, I hope I'm not summarizing him wrongly, but there's no contradiction there. He was simply describing commercial society. He wasn't saying it's necessarily the most wonderful thing. So that's an example of a neoclassical counter-revolution. You take out of economic thought that which is convenient to you. This went right through the 18th century in what's called the anti-Ricardian reaction. And Ricardo was particularly dangerous for the capitalist class because of his theory of rent. Because he said rent, unlike Smith, he said rent was not anything arising from a contribution of the landowner. Rent was a part of the surplus that the landowner was able to extract by virtue of his ownership of the land. Now, what then happened was the Ricardian socialists came along, people like Thomas Hodgkin and so on, Marx's predecessors in England, And they said, well, if rent is a deduction from value created elsewhere, surely that's also true of profit. And John Stuart Mill wrote a wonderful passage where he says, well, whether this is true or not, it's so dangerous to existing civilization, we can't accept it. So he applied an ideological criterion of truth. And that's the characteristic form of these neoclassical revolutions. Then Marx became very popular. And what did you get? The marginalist revolution. Then Keynes became very popular. And what do you get? You get the neoliberal revolution. But the grounds for the neoliberal revolution, counter-revolution, were already being laid by the development of what I call the equilibrium paradigm in economics. The notion you can analyze an economy as if it was going to reproduce itself perfectly. And all the theories that are so damaging to people that the IMF has imposed are justified by a variant of equilibrium theory, neoclassical growth theory, neoclassical trade theory. Countless works are published demonstrating that this is without scientific foundation. It doesn't have the facts, it's full of contradictions. People just carry on. So what does that mean? It means that the institution of economics has been captured by the ideological interests that are paid for by the capitalists, and in particular paid for by the imperialists. I think there's a deep sense in which modern economics is actually as much an imperialist philosophy as it is a capitalist philosophy. And so the consequence of that is the IMF becomes run by people, they really believe these things. I mean, I've argued and discussed with them many times. They're not lying. They're not saying, well, we'll say this because it looks better. But they're driven in that direction by their conditions of employment. The people who say the most extreme things get the Nobel, get prizes, get publication. So you have a hierarchical system in economics. And if there is any dissent, it's suppressed.